Welcome to Sherlock Holmes Mystery. A chilling mystery awaits in fog-shrouded London. The case of the footsteps behind the painting. A chilling secret stirs in foggy London, and only Holmes can unveil it. But tell us, detective, where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments below. On a bleak afternoon in late November, when London's fugitive light seemed to wither even before it touched the drab facades of Wimpole Street, an event occurred in Portland Place, which, for several days thereafter, was the sole subject of excited discourse at gentlemen's clubs, taverns, and kitchen grates alike. It was said first in a whisper and then in a clatter of talk that Sir Benedict Tolliver, the noted philanthropist and collector of English portraiture, had been found dead in his private gallery under circumstances as singular as they were inexplicable, that the chamber was locked within, that the only witness to the catastrophe was a terrified footman who declared, with every sign of sincerity, that he had heard footsteps, heavy, purposeful footsteps pacing behind a certain painting mere seconds before the fatal cry. When Scotland Yard is brought up short, as now and again it must be, it is my lot to see, sometimes at the outset and sometimes after the official zeal has wearied itself into routine, how Sherlock Holmes bends his talents upon what ordinary minds consider impenetrable. At the time of Sir Benedict's calamity, Holmes and I had returned but recently from a dull excursion into the country, where a case of apparent poaching had turned out to be nothing more than the music teacher's illicit courting at twilight. Holmes had slept little and smoked much, and even that morning had spoken not 2 sentences to me. The first concerning a hole moths had made in his Inverness cape, the second a curt request for the Stradivarius. By evening, the fog rose, a pale and greasy thing that pressed its face to our windows. I had drawn the curtains and was laying a fresh log upon our grate when a hansom rattled up to Baker Street. A hurried foot, a ring, an exchange of voices below, and, a moment later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a gentleman of middle years whose aspect bore the stamp of rank and recent shock. He was high-chested and clean-shaven, with a soldier's economy and movement, but his eyes showed the dilated vigilance of a man who listens for a repetition of some dreadful sound. "Dr. Watson," said Mrs. Hudson in her comfortable Scots, "and Mr. Holmes, Sir Peregrine Tolliver." The newcomer bowed stiffly. "Forgive the hour. I am pressed for counsel." He glanced from me to Holmes, who had not risen from the settee, but whose grey eyes, clear as rain on slate, had already taken in every detail of our visitor's person. "You are late of Cairo," Holmes murmured, "and of a melancholy habit with regard to cigars. You lost your valet a fortnight ago, and more pertinently, you have come regarding your brother." Sir Peregrine's hand tightened upon his stick. "This is most extraordinary." "Yes, my brother. Benedict is dead, Mr. Holmes, dead in his own gallery, with every entrance secure and no means by which a murderer might have come or gone." Holmes's head tipped, as though he had been a violin string plucked lightly by an invisible hand. "Pray sit. You have brought the Yard?" "They are there already. Inspector Lestrade is in charge." Holmes's thin lips curved by the slightest degree. "Then we shall be spared the preliminary fussing. You spoke of a locked chamber." Sir Peregrine's narrative emerged with a soldier's concision. Sir Benedict, a widower possessed of considerable means and a taste for patronage, kept a small palace in Portland Place. His private gallery, fitted in the Italian manner, occupied the 2nd floor at the back, overlooking a narrow mews. Though the room gave an impression of antiquity, its conveniences were of the latest sort: electric bells, patent locks, a skylight strengthened with wire, and leaded bars to deter burglars. On this particular afternoon, Sir Benedict had dismissed his secretary at 4:30, instructing that he was not to be disturbed while he catalogued a recent acquisition. Tea had been taken away untasted. At 10 minutes to 6, the butler, Mason, sent the young footman, a pale lad by the name of George, upstairs to inquire whether his master would receive a visitor who had called unannounced. The footman went along the corridor, turned the corner by the linen press, and approached the gallery's gilt door. Before he could knock, he halted. From within, muffled yet unmistakable, there came the measured tread of a man pacing 5 or 6 steps, and then a pause, then again a heavier tread, as if burdened. The boy stood uncertain, his knuckles lifted. At that instant arose a cry, short, raw, and strangled off, as if a hand had clapped over the mouth that uttered it. The tread ceased. Silence, the boy cried out. Servants rushed up. The door was locked, and the key was inside. The window was secured with its bolts and bars. The skylight high above showed the dull square of evening, undisturbed. When they burst the door with a shoulder and a coal hammer, they found Sir Benedict upon the Turkish rug in the very center of the room, fallen somewhat forward onto his right side. His face was turned away, and his hands were clenched. There was blood, but little. The man's own revolver lay near his left hand, not fired. A chair was overturned. The paintings, Gainsborough's and Sir Joshua's, looked on in their genteel silence. Nothing was in disorder save for a narrow ladder used to attend the higher canvases, which leaned where the footman swore it had not been earlier in the day. On the wall to the right, a piece of gilt moulding had somehow sprung, and the portrait that usually occupied that space, a striking 3/4 likeness of Lady Aurelia Anselm in blue satin, hung up a degree lower upon one hook, as if some clumsy hand had jarred it. Behind the painting, when they raised it, there was nothing but a firm wall and, in that wall, the bell wire and the trace of a plaster repair of former date. Nothing else, and yet the boy swore that the very footsteps he had heard had sounded from behind that very canvas. Lestrade had been sent for. He examined, he questioned, he nodded in his pinched way. There was, he held, no practical mode by which a killer could have entered or left. The servants were all accounted for below stairs. Sir Benedict's secretary had not been in the house since afternoon. No one had passed the porter at the mews. Lestrade's men were even now posting at the exits, and a surgeon was on his way. Nevertheless, Sir Peregrine finished, his voice grown hoarse. My brother is dead upon the floor of his own sanctum, and something was moving behind that painting. The boy is no liar, but the wall, Mr. Holmes, is solid. What can be done with such madness? Holmes had listened, with his head bowed and his fingertips together. A posture I knew portended an awakening of that singular concentration which I had seen, more than once, master a knot that would have chafed any other mind into helplessness. He rose now with quick decision. "Watson," said he, "your coat. We shall call upon Portland Place before the yard grows satisfied with the explanation nearest to hand." Sir Peregrine rose also. "You will come at once?" "At once." Our hansom was called. As we descended the stair, a breath of fog pressed inward at the open door, bringing with it the sharp, damp scent of the city, coal and wet stone, and the distant hollow ringing of hoof upon cobble. Sir Peregrine rode in grim silence, his gloved fingers working upon the head of his stick. Holmes stared into the obscured street with the expression of a man reading a page by touch, alone. I confess a stirring of that mingled dread and curiosity, which the very name of a locked chamber sets moving in the imagination. For the human heart is a locked chamber also, and the devilry that goes in and out there is as frequent as it is unrecorded. Yet rooms of plaster and brick are usually more honest than men. We found the Tolliver house flaring with gas at every window, a watch of curious faces already defeated by the constable at the railings. Within, the marble of the hall glittered, and the consoling paraphernalia of great houses, bronze urns, palms. The portrait of a long-dead admiral regarded us with that cold assurance which wealth lends to death itself. Sir Peregrine led us up, and the strange hush that comes upon a house at such times seemed to deepen with every step, as though the very floorboards were listening. Lestrade met us at the landing, a small, alert figure with the weathered confidence of a terrier. "Holmes," said he, wasting neither bow nor sarcasm, "you are quick upon scent tonight. "The scent appears to be turpentine," said Holmes dryly, sniffing the air. "And something else, a draught, if I am not mistaken, in a room where no draught should be. Draught, the windows bolted and the skylight is what you might call armored," Lestrade returned. "We have kept the place as near to its state as might be, until the surgeon has done. Thought you might wish to cast your eye." We entered. I have seen death in fields and alleys, and I have laid my hand upon the brow of the newly departed friend and of the long-suffering stranger. But there was a peculiar desolation in that gallery. The gas jets along the cornice hissed faintly, their light skimmed the varnish of canvases and fell cold upon the Turkish rug where Sir Benedict lay, his face at last turned so that we could see its aspect. It was not the rictus of terror, as I had feared. Rather, a kind of amazed protest, as if something wholly unexpected had laid a hand upon him and asked a question to which he could not supply the answer. I knelt and made the brief, mechanical examination which is the habit of my profession. There was a bruise at the base of the skull, not large but perilous in its placement, a thread of blood from the right ear, and a faint odor. No, I checked myself. Perhaps it was no more than the general smell of oils and clean cloth, and the rubber mats upon which the frames rested when newly hung. His hands were clenched, as Sir Peregrine had said, and in the left, the ridges of the palm bore the faintest dusting of some fine powder. I lifted the fingers, then let them lie. Holmes had moved at once to the right-hand wall and regarded the drooping portrait with that keen stillness which is more telling, with him, than a flurry of exclamations. The ladder stood near, below the painting, upon the Persian border. A muddied arc showed where a boot, no small one, had pivoted. Beyond that mark, there was nothing. No continuation of the mud across the room. No trace upon the boards by the window. In the quiet, one heard only Lestrade shifting his weight, and the delicate patter of the fog against the glass dome above. "The footsteps, George?" Holmes addressed the footman, who stood white and rigid by the door. "Yes, sir," the boy whispered. "Behind the lady in the blue satin. As plain as—" he swallowed. "As plain as if the wall could walk." Holmes's lip twitched. "Walls prefer to stand, in my experience. Still, you did well." He turned to the moulding where it had sprung and put the tip of one long finger to a fleck of gold leaf that had fallen. He did not pick it up. His gaze ranged upward to the skylight, with its grid of wire, downward to the faint scuff at the baseboard, outward, finally, to the solid line of the right-hand wall. "It is a curious room," Holmes said at last, lightly, almost cheerfully. "And it will have something curious to tell us. Lestrade, pray keep everyone below stairs and the doors watched. Sir Peregrine, you have my condolences. Dr. Watson, do not stir from my side." What followed, that first cold survey, the smell of turpentine and the whisper of fog, the dead man's quiet reproach, the painting's disordered poise, was the beginning of one of those puzzles which, once entered, compel the mind through a sequence of chambers, each more bewildering than the last, until the simple daylight comes in at the end and shows you the tracks you should have seen from the first. But at that moment, we were in the half-light. And somewhere, in that room without a draught, something breathed. Holmes's eyes brightened in their hollows. "Behind the painting," he murmured, almost to himself, "or behind the thought of a painting. Well then, let us listen." Holmes moved neither to the body nor to the door, but to the nearest gas jet, where he turned the tap until the flame dwindled to a blue bead. From his pocket he drew a small spill and held it upright at shoulder height, stepping slowly along the right-hand wall. The slender flame trembled once, twice, most markedly, when he paused beneath the drooping portrait of Lady Aurelia. "A draught," he said softly, and let the spill gutter out upon his nail, from a wall that has no aperture. He knelt, eyes level with the skirting, and traced the junction of wood and plaster with the blade of his penknife. not cutting, only feeling the give. "Watson, your hand. Lay it here." I obeyed. The paint was chill, and, if I did not deceive myself, a thread of colder air crept against the knuckle. He rose at once and inspected the ladder. The rubber on one foot was abraded and bore a crescent of dried grit. He sniffed. "Mews mud. The Mews is swept at noon. We shall call this later than 4 o'clock. He sighted along the rungs, then set the ladder where the footman insisted it had not been, and mounted lightly, balancing himself with a palm upon the gilt frame. His other hand went, not to the picture, but to the cornice where the moulding had sprung. He touched, paused, and smiled in that thin way of his which made one feel that some line in an invisible diagram had just been completed. Descending, he examined the carpet anew. The muddied arc before the ladder had its answer opposite, not a mark, merely a place where dust lay in a different temper, as if a weight had been set and removed. "Lestrade," said he, "you have kept all from this room, save the servants and the surgeon." "All," Lestrade returned, "save Sir Peregrine and yourselves. And the secretary, gone since 4:30. We have a man at his rooms." Lestrade tilted his head at me. "Dr. Carew, neat fellow. No scandal to his name. Neat fellows sometimes polish their consciences with their boots," Holmes observed, and turned to the bell-push beside the door. He pressed. A faint jingle answered below. He unscrewed the brass plate with a turn of his knife. Behind it lay the bell wire, new and taut, riding in a narrow channel of fresh plaster to vanish behind the picture's wall. Holmes refixed the plate and examined his fingers. "Plaster dust," he murmured, and looked towards Sir Benedict's clenched left hand, where, as I had noted, a fine powder lay in the lines. He said nothing of it, but his glance lingered a heartbeat too long for mere curiosity. At his request, the butler Mason and the footman George repeated their stories with such minor variations as one expects when fear and formality shake the memory. From the butler, we learned that Sir Benedict had been out only briefly in the morning. He had returned with a parcel, a painter's parcel, sir, brown paper and string, which he took himself to the gallery. He was particular about his pictures, Mason said, looking at the floor. Would not have so much as a duster touched them save by his direction. The parcel paper, when asked after, could not be found. And who last touched the skylight? "No one, sir. That is, only Mr. Ducker from Calver and Sons, when the bars were fitted 6 months back. Master would not have it that the city should drop through, as it were." Holmes sent George to fetch a basin and a decanter of water. While the lad was gone, he stood over the dead man. He did not touch the bruise, nor the hands, but leaned until his nose was within an inch of the hair behind the right ear. "You observed an odor, Watson?" "I thought I did. Oils, perhaps, and something faintly sweet." "Just so." He did not enlarge. When George returned, Holmes rinsed his fingers, then crossed to the long curtain that framed the window. On its inner hem lay the palest smear, like a fingertip passed through cold cream. He lifted the hem to the light, then let it fall. "If anyone had entered by the window, we should see the marks upon the sill," Lestrade put in. "There are none." Indeed, Holmes's approval was genuine, and yet we would have our draught. He dropped to one knee at the baseboard beneath Lady Aurelia, and, with what looked like carelessness, allowed the back of his hand to brush the lowest gilt edge. A whisper of grit fell. He bent, and in that instant his face altered. His fingers made a delicate plucking motion and closed upon something so slender I could not at first discern it. When he straightened, his hand was empty. He faced Sir Peregrine. "Your brother bought pictures," he said. "Did he also part with them?" "Never willingly," Sir Peregrine replied. "He sold one Holbein in '87 to fund a hospital wing. He repented it every day after." "Then the walls have not changed their inhabitants of late?" "No." Holmes nodded as though some private hypothesis had received a fractional nourishment. He turned to Lestrade. "You propose what?" "Apoplexy from agitation, with a fall against the frame or self-violence clumsily attempted. "I propose to wait upon the surgeon," Lestrade said tartly, "and to keep the exits while we settle the secretary." He eyed Holmes. "And you?" "I shall ask the wall a question," Holmes replied, "and listen very closely to how it lies." Holmes drew a small folding rule from his pocket and measured along the panel just beneath the painting, marking faint intervals with his thumb. He tapped each section with the handle of his knife, sharp, short raps that echoed differently along the wall. For several inches, the sound was dull and uniform. Then, at one point near the corner, a fainter resonance answered him, hollow and metallic, like the inside of a pipe. "Watson, note this," he said quietly, and motioned for me to crouch beside him. "Feel there, beneath the plaster line." I pressed my fingers to the wall. It yielded ever so slightly, as if stretched thin over some hidden cavity. "A hollow," I murmured. Holmes nodded. "Precisely, but not wide enough for a man. Perhaps a shaft, or an air vent, a channel for the wires, perhaps, but then—" His words drifted into thought as he stepped back. "A draught strong enough to quiver a flame does not come from so small a conduit. There is more here than plaster." He turned abruptly to Lestrade. "Have any men examined the floor beneath this room?" "The dining hall lies below," said the inspector. "We've checked nothing amiss." "Nothing amiss to your eyes, perhaps," Holmes said, not unkindly. "Still, I must see it for myself." Before Lestrade could protest, Holmes had taken a candle and was already descending the back stair, his quick, soundless tread forcing us to follow at once. The dining hall below was a splendid chamber of oak and silver, its ceiling ornamented by molded squares. Holmes crouched at once, studying the cornice where the ceiling joined the wall that corresponded to the gallery above. He laid his ear against the wood, then rapped thrice. I fancied I heard a faint echo, not through the wall, but behind it, an answering emptiness. Holmes's face sharpened. "Lestrade," he said, "I will wager my violin that between this wall and the outer masonry there lies a passage narrow, perhaps no wider than a man's shoulders, but serviceable to one who knew of it. Your draught, Watson, is the air that creeps through its seams." Sir Peregrine started. "A secret passage?" "Impossible. The house was built by my grandfather. I have lived here 40 years. I would have known." "Would you?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Men have lived their lives atop graves they never guessed. Old houses are like old families, they keep their secrets. I fancy your brother knew this one." He motioned to the butler. "Bring a lantern, if you please, and something stout, a screwdriver or chisel." When Mason returned, Holmes guided him to the spot where the hollow sound had been most distinct. With a few deft pries, the molding came away, revealing a thin line of blackness between two beams. Holmes bent close, the lantern glow outlining his sharp profile. "Observe," he said. "Here is our draught's mouth." He pressed lightly. The panel trembled, then shifted inward with a slow sigh of released dust. Behind it lay a slit of darkness no wider than a man's arm. Lestrade swore under his breath. "By heaven, Holmes, if someone's used that—" "Patience, my dear fellow." Holmes slipped his arm into the void, feeling upward and sideways. "Ah, stone here. Smooth, no. Polished. Brickwork farther in. Yes, yes. A very old construction, narrower than I thought. But, yes, a ladder. Or iron rung." He withdrew his arm and straightened, brushing off plaster dust. "It runs vertically, I believe, between this floor and the gallery above, possibly continuing downward to the cellars. A convenient little artery, eh, Lestrade? One might step from the mews, ascend unseen, and listen at a wall." Sir Peregrine's face had blanched. "You think someone crept in this way to kill my brother?" "I think," Holmes said evenly. that someone who knew this passage was very near when your brother died. Whether he struck or only watched, we have yet to learn. He replaced the molding, sealing the secret as swiftly as he had found it. No one is to disturb this spot, Lestrade. Post a man outside the house tonight. No word to the servants. If our visitor believes his secret still safe, he may return to see whether his work was well done. Holmes wiped his fingers with a handkerchief and regarded the lantern flame as though seeing some pattern within it. Watson, you remarked the bruise and the powder on the hand. Together, they tell a tale, the first of struggle, the second of touch. The man grasped something before he fell, something fine, brittle, coated in dust. Perhaps a fragment from this very wall. But why reach upward unless his assailant stood above him? Lestrade frowned. The ladder? Or the picture itself? Holmes said quietly. He may have torn something as he fell. Tomorrow, in daylight, we shall remove that painting and see what Our Lady in Blue conceals. For now, I have what I need. As we turned toward the hall, a sudden gust stirred the lamps. The flame fluttered and went out, plunging us into a muffled half-dark. Holmes's voice came low but steady through the gloom. You see, Watson, how the air shifts, even now. Our unseen friend has left a breathing space behind these walls. I should not be surprised if he uses it yet. He struck a match, lighting the way back to the stairs. Tonight we let him think us blind. Tomorrow we make him step once more behind his painting. The night outside had deepened into a fog-laden stillness when Holmes and I at last took our leave of the Tolliver mansion. Sir Peregrine remained by the stair, his face pale under the flickering gaslight, while Lestrade busied himself with his constables. The house seemed to listen, every creak of timber like a held breath. Holmes paused on the threshold, his keen gaze sweeping once more across the darkened facade, as though the bricks themselves might yield their secret. You will lock the gallery, he said quietly to Lestrade, and set your men not within, but without. Our quarry will be less wary if he believes the lion caged. Then, with that abrupt decisiveness which brooked no debate, he turned and stepped into the fog. Our cab lurched away from Portland Place, its wheels hissing softly over the wet stones. For a time, neither of us spoke. I watched Holmes in the dim light of the street lamps. The thin column of smoke from his cigarette, twisting upward like thought made visible. His eyes had that inward gleam I had come to recognize the light of some intricate pattern forming in the depths of his mind. You are silent, Holmes, I ventured. Have you formed a theory? He smiled faintly. A theory, my dear Watson, is a delicate thing. One must not expose it too early to the chill of facts. Still, yes, I have an outline. The colors are yet blurred, but the design emerges. Then you believe this secret passage was indeed used? I believe it was known to Sir Benedict, he replied. Possibly to one other. A man does not conceal a door in his own wall without purpose. Tell me, Watson, what did you observe about that portrait, the Lady in Blue? Only that it hung lower than the rest, I said, and that the frame was disturbed. Holmes nodded. And the subject? A fine piece. The woman's expression struck me melancholy, perhaps, but beautiful. You might almost fancy her watching the room. Ah, Holmes's eyes lit briefly. You perceive more than you admit. The gaze of that portrait, my friend, may yet prove as vital as any fingerprint. But patience, patience. He drew on his cigarette. Tomorrow, daylight will show us what the lamplight concealed. There is something behind that painting, something not intended for the public eye. We returned to Baker Street, where Mrs. Hudson's protests at the lateness of the hour were met with Holmes's customary disregard. He flung his coat across the chair, pulled a map of London from the shelf, and began marking it with quick, precise strokes of pencil. The mews behind the Tolliver house, he muttered, connects with Montford Lane and from there to the smaller tradesmen's courts. A useful route for one wishing to come unseen. Lestrade's men will watch the front, But our friend, if he returns, will use the back." He paced a moment, the lines between his brows deepening. "You recall the powder on Sir Benedict's hand? It was no common dust. Finely ground plaster, mixed with iron filings, faintly scented, yes, with turpentine. I detected the trace near the curtain as well. Such a blend might cling to tools used in repairing gilt frames or concealed panels. Whoever stood behind that painting had worked there recently. You think the murderer was an artisan then? A restorer, perhaps." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps. Or someone posing as such, yet I hesitate to limit our field so soon. Let us say only that the hand behind the wall was no stranger to the gallery's secrets." He consulted his watch. 1:30. "You, Watson, will oblige me by obtaining 4 hours' rest." We returned to Portland Place with the dawn. When morning came, grey and thin through the fog, we were once more in the Tolliver Gallery. Lestrade, haggard but alert, had kept the vigil as instructed. The air of the room was cold and heavy, as though death lingered still in the draperies. Holmes wasted no words. He had brought with him a small tool roll and a magnifying lens. And in minutes, he had the portrait of Lady Aurelia lifted from its hooks. The wall behind was smooth at first glance, but Holmes's probing fingers found, just beneath the upper right corner, a narrow seam almost invisible where the gilt molding met the plaster. With a delicate pressure, a section of the wall slid outward on a concealed hinge, revealing a recess scarcely a foot deep. Within it hung a coil of wire, some fragments of crumbled paper, and, most curiously, a small, glass-sided box filled with fine ash. Lestrade leaned forward, puzzled. "What in heaven's name?" Holmes lifted the box carefully, his expression unreadable. "Ash of burnt paper, I should judge. The remnants of correspondence, perhaps. A prudent man's fire. But look here." He pointed to a corner of the recess, where the plaster bore a fresh gouge. Embedded in the dust was a tiny scrap of red sealing wax, bearing the impression of a crest, a falcon rampant upon a shield. Sir Peregrine, who had joined us at dawn, gasped softly. "That is the Tolliver crest," he said. "My brother used it for his private letters only." Holmes's mouth curved in satisfaction. "Then we may assume that whatever was destroyed here bore his hand, and that someone took care the contents should never reach another's eyes." Lestrade gave a short grunt. "Then your murderer burned the letters? Or Sir Benedict himself?" Holmes replied. "We do not yet know which. But this, gentlemen, is the heart of our mystery. A hidden compartment, a secret passage, and letters burned to ash. The portrait was both guardian and witness. And somewhere his voice dropped to a whisper. The footsteps behind it belonged to one who watched that destruction, unseen. The silence that followed was broken only by the faint creak of the house settling in the morning chill. Then Holmes straightened, eyes gleaming. "Come, Watson. I have a small errand before luncheon, a visit to an engraver in Fleet Street, who may tell us who last impressed that seal. The dead man's ghost will not walk long if his crest has betrayed his secrets." The morning air outside was sharp and brittle, biting through the fog as we left the Tolliver mansion. Holmes, his coat drawn tight about him, moved with such restless intensity that I was hard-pressed to keep pace. He hailed no cab but strode the length of Portland Place to Oxford Circus before speaking, his voice carrying the quick precision of a mind running several tracks ahead of itself. "You observed the recess, Watson? A small matter, yet it shifts the entire structure of the case. The ash, the sealing wax, the hidden panel, all deliberate acts. One does not burn letters in secret compartments unless their contents threaten exposure. Then you believe Sir Benedict destroyed them himself?" Holmes shook his head. "That is the question, my dear fellow. Either he sought to destroy what might ruin him, or another sought to erase what might condemn them. The powder upon his palm, That speaks volumes, but we must not theorize without the missing link. Let us find the craftsman who cut that crest into the wax. Every seal has its character, as distinct as a man's hand. We turned into Fleet Street, that artery of ink and rumour, where presses thudded like heartbeats beneath the paving stones. The fog hung low, curling around iron lamps and the hats of hurrying clerks. Holmes led me to a narrow doorway between a print shop and a tobacconist. The faded sign above it reading, Thaddeus Riving, seal engraver and heraldic artist. Within, the air smelled of wax, oil, and time. An elderly man with spectacles perched upon his brow looked up from his bench. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," said he, with the tone of one not unfamiliar with our visits. "You've a crest for me to trace, I wager?" Holmes inclined his head, setting the scrap of sealing wax upon the counter. A curious impression riving. Falcon, rampant. Shield proper. The Tolliver arms. I should like to know who last ordered such a matrix. The engraver adjusted his lenses and examined the scrap under a lamp. Recent work. No doubt of it, the cut is clean. Modern tools. Not one of my own, though I've repaired the Tolliver seal in my time. You repaired it? Holmes asked sharply. When? 3 years ago, sir. For Sir Benedict himself. But this is not that matrix. Different depth in the falcon's wing, sharper ridge to the shield's border. I'd say a duplicate. Commissioned, perhaps, from Eden of Piccadilly. He's taken some of my old clients since my hand began to shake. Holmes gave a short, satisfied nod. Eden of Piccadilly. You have done me a service, Riving. Come. Watson. Within half an hour we stood in the polished showroom of Mr. Eden, who received us with that blend of servility and suspicion peculiar to men whose trade lies between luxury and discretion. Holmes wasted no words, merely laid the fragment upon the counter and fixed the man with his cool grey gaze. Eden hesitated. Ah, yes, I recall this work. Commissioned perhaps a month past. A duplicate of Sir Benedict Tolliver's crest, exact in every detail. And by whom was it ordered? By his secretary, Dr. Adrian Carow. Holmes's expression did not alter, but I saw his eyes flash with that gleam of satisfaction which always heralded some crucial connection in his chain of reasoning. Dr. Carow, indeed, and what explanation did he offer? Merely that Sir Benedict required a new seal for private correspondence, as the old one was worn, paid in cash, and took it away himself. When we emerged again into the grey daylight, Holmes's stride lengthened, his shoulders taut as a bowstring. There, Watson, is the hinge upon which our mystery turns. A duplicate seal in the secretary's hands, a set of letters burned to ash, and a secret passage known perhaps only to two. The servant's story of the footsteps grows clearer. Suppose now that Sir Benedict had discovered some act of deceit, an alteration of his correspondence. Perhaps by one who possessed that false seal. Suppose he confronted the man in his gallery. I stared at him. You think Carow forged his master's letters? Or intercepted them? Holmes replied. We must not narrow too soon. The ash tells us the letters were destroyed in haste. The bruise, that violence followed. Carow may have feared exposure, or Sir Benedict may have perished by his own rash hand in the struggle. But whichever the case, Carow holds the missing key. We returned to Portland Place just past noon. Lestrade met us at the door, his expression grim. You're just in time, Holmes. We've found your secretary, though not where we expected. The man's gone missing. His lodgings stand open, papers scattered, and no one's seen him since yesterday evening. Holmes's eyes lit with fierce interest. Then the game has truly begun. Watson, we are now hunting a man who knows how to vanish through walls. If Dr. Carow has fled, it is not fear of arrest that drives him, it is fear of discovery. He turned to Lestrade, his voice crisp and low. Keep your men at the house, but draw them back from the rear mews. The rat runs only when the trap is quiet. Tonight, I believe, he will return for something he has left behind." Lestrade frowned. "And what might that be?" Holmes smiled thinly. "A mistake, Inspector. Every criminal leaves one, and Dr. Adrian Carrows may be waiting for us behind the Lady in Blue." The afternoon darkened into one of those dense London twilights where fog and soot seem to conspire against the lamps. Holmes and I took our meal hastily at Baker Street, for he would neither rest nor allow me to linger in speculation. His manner had grown taut, every motion charged with the concentration of a mind closing upon its prey. "It is no longer a question of who struck the blow, Watson," he said as he pushed aside his plate untouched. "It is a question of why the blow was struck and by what fear it was driven. Dr. Adrian Carrow was no common thief. He is a man of education, subtlety, and nerve. Such a man does not flee from accident or chance. He flees from exposure." "And yet," I said, "you believe he will return to the Tolliver house?" "I am certain of it. His flight was unprepared, too abrupt. A man who absconds in fear leaves behind the very thing he most desires to hide. He will come back for it. And tonight, when he thinks the house watched only by Lestrade's weary constables, he will try his luck once more behind that painted wall." By 7 o'clock, we were again in Portland Place. The fog pressed thick upon the windows and muffled the city's sound until it seemed the house stood alone in some soundless gulf. Lestrade, weary but obedient, had followed Holmes's directions to the letter. The servants were dismissed for the night. Sir Peregrine had withdrawn to his chamber under solemn promise not to stir. The constables were stationed outside, beyond sight or hearing of the gallery windows. Within, the gas was lowered to a dim glow. Holmes surveyed the room with satisfaction. "We will have no better stage for our experiment," he murmured. "Watson, you will take position here, by the window curtain. I shall remain near the door. If anything stirs behind that painting, do not speak, observe only." The clock upon the mantel ticked with a slow and solemn pulse. Beyond the shuttered glass, the fog brushed faintly, like a whispering hand. Minutes dragged by, merging into an hour. The chill crept upward through the boards. I confess that a strange unease took hold of me. The stillness of the room, the fixed gaze of the painted lady, the thought of the unseen passage beyond. At last Holmes stirred. "Our guest delays," he breathed. "Perhaps he waits for full darkness." But even as he spoke, there came a faint metallic sound, a vibration rather than a noise somewhere deep within the wall. Holmes's eyes flashed toward mine. Another moment passed, then a subtle shift in the draught stirred the flame of the gas jet. The air seemed to tremble. Holmes moved soundlessly to the ladder and leaned close to the painting. There was a soft click, a scrape, and the slightest movement in the gilt frame. The portrait swayed outward by a hair's breadth. Through that narrow space, a hand appeared pale, nervous, trembling. It groped downward, feeling along the edge of the recess Holmes had discovered. Then, from behind the picture, there came the faintest sigh of breath. In an instant, Holmes's long arm shot forward. His hand seized the intruder's wrist in an iron grip. A strangled cry broke from behind the canvas, followed by a furious struggle. The portrait lurched, half torn from its moorings, and a man tumbled through the narrow gap, striking the carpet with a heavy thud. Holmes was upon him before I could move. "Dr. Adrian Carrow, I think," he said. Breathless but triumphant, "you return to collect your ashes and find your own reputation among them." The man upon the floor was indeed the secretary. His fine features were distorted by fear and exhaustion. His clothes bore the grime of flight. He looked from Holmes to me with the wild eyes of a trapped animal. "You, how did you?" "Spare us the astonishment," Holmes said curtly. "Your flight betrayed you. You were seen leaving by the Mews, and when the morning papers cried your name, you had no refuge but the one place you believed safe, your secret path back to the gallery." Carrow's composure broke. "I came only for the letters," he gasped. They are mine, mine by right. He would have ruined me, destroyed my career. Because you forged his correspondence? Holmes's tone was soft but merciless. Caro's head jerked upward. He forced me to it. He gave me no choice. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Ah, then there was blackmail. The man shuddered and covered his face. He found out, he whispered, about the papers, about the investments under my name. I used his seal only once, to save myself. He would have exposed me. I begged him, God. I begged him, but he laughed. He tore my confession in half and turned to burn it. I tried to stop him. The revolver fell. He struck his head. The confession choked in his throat. Holmes's expression softened for one instant only. So he died not by intent, but by your folly. You sought to hide the evidence and burned what might have saved you. Caro groaned and sank against the carpet, defeated. Lestrade, summoned by Holmes's signal, entered with his men, their boots dull against the rug. The inspector took in the scene with grim satisfaction. Holmes straightened, his face pale in the gaslight. Take him gently, Lestrade. The law will see to the rest. Our task is finished, save one question. He turned toward the portrait, now hanging askew, its painted eyes gazing down upon us with uncanny serenity. I fancy, Watson, that the lady in blue has witnessed all she cared to. Let her rest, for she has seen justice done twice over. As the constables led Caro away, the house fell silent once more. Holmes stood a long moment before the shattered painting, then turned to me with that weary half-smile I had seen so often when triumph brought no pleasure. Another man destroyed by his own cleverness, he murmured, and another wall that whispered the truth to those who would listen. The fog was thinning by the time we left Portland Place, and the lamps of Baker Street glimmered like pale coins scattered through the mist. Holmes, silent for once, sat opposite me in the cab, his long fingers clasped upon his knees and his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the rattling pain. I had come to know that silence well. It was the interval of recoil after the storm, when the strain of intellect yielded to that inward withdrawal, peculiar to his temperament. Yet there was something different now, a shadow of unrest that his usual detachment could not wholly mask. You are not satisfied, I said at last. The man has confessed. The means and motive are plain enough. Why this disquiet? Holmes stirred as though from reverie. Plain enough to Lestrade, perhaps. Yet there remains a thread that will not tie. The confession answers for Sir Benedict's death, but not for what followed. Why did Dr. Caro return? His fear was genuine. He could have fled the country. What, then, was worth the risk? The letters, I suggested. He said they were his by right. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Just so, and yet we found no trace of them in the recess. Only ash. No man would creep through a secret passage to claim what no longer exists. No, Watson. He came for something else. Something still hidden. He leaned forward, the ghost of a smile flickering at his lips. And consider this. The bruise upon, the head, the weapon unfired, the hand clenched about plaster dust. These are not the marks of a struggle between equals. The scene was arranged to mislead, but not by Caro. Our secretary blundered into a design larger than his own. I frowned. Then you believe another hand was involved? Perhaps not in the death, but certainly in the concealment. The house itself speaks of duplicity. Old structures remember their builders, Watson, and this one was built for secrets. I must see it once more, this time in daylight. He tapped the roof, and the cab turned abruptly. I could not suppress a sigh of mingled fatigue and curiosity. Back to the Tolliver mansion? Where else should we go? He said lightly, but where the dead still whisper. The fog had all but lifted when we reached the house. Lestrade had gone, leaving a single constable at the gate. Within, the air was stale, with a lingering odor of burnt paper and lamp smoke. The portrait of Lady Aurelia, now removed from its place, leaned against the far wall, its expression solemn as a mourner's. Holmes walked straight to the recess and examined it anew. His movements were unhurried, almost meditative. You see, Watson, he said. "How the hinge here runs further than the compartment's edge. Observe if I press here, the wall yields." I watched as he slipped a thin blade into the corner. There was a faint, metallic click, and a second panel slid outward, revealing a deeper cavity lined with oak. Within it lay a small, leather-bound ledger, no larger than a prayer book, and beside it, a velvet pouch tied with a silver cord. Holmes drew both out gently. "The real prize," he murmured. "Caro's letters were but the veil. Let us see what the veil concealed." The ledger's pages were covered in neat, compact script figures, dates and names. I glimpsed enough to know they dealt not with art or philanthropy, but with transactions of a far darker hue. Holmes's eyes glittered as he turned the leaves. "Forgery, extortion, and influence," he said softly. "Sir Benedict was no innocent patron of the arts, Watson. These are records of bribes, payments from politicians, merchants, even judges. He was a spider at the center of a very silken web." He untied the velvet pouch. Inside was a small object, heavy and metallic. When he held it to the light, I saw a ring gold, engraved with the falcon crest, and set with a single dark sapphire. "Sir Benedict's signet," I exclaimed. "But we saw it nowhere upon his person." "Just so," said Holmes. "It was taken from him. Caro may have forged his seal, but another took the symbol of his power. This ring is the key to the ledger, each page signed with the impression of this very gem. Whoever held it controlled the proof." A quiet step in the corridor made us both turn. Sir Peregrine stood at the doorway, pale but composed, his eyes fixed upon the open compartment. "You have found it, then," he said evenly. "I wondered how long it would take." Holmes regarded him without surprise. "I begin to think you expected us to." The older man entered the room with slow dignity. "My brother's affairs were complex. You have uncovered what should have remained buried." Holmes's tone was calm, almost courteous. "Then you knew of these records?" Sir Peregrine hesitated. "I knew enough. Benedict was reckless. His so-called philanthropy was a mask. Those ledgers could have destroyed families, reputations mine among them. And when your brother threatened exposure," Holmes said softly, "you saw to it that silence fell upon him." The baronet's composure faltered. "You dare." "I dare nothing," Holmes interrupted quietly. "The facts dare." The plaster dust in Sir Benedict's hand matched the composition of this panel, which had been disturbed before the fatal night. The draught we traced was stronger than a mere air vent. It came from the corridor you alone had ordered sealed years ago. And, most telling of all, the signet ring missing from the corpse, yet found hidden where only the master of the house could reach. For a long moment, Sir Peregrine stood unmoving. Then his shoulders sagged, and his gaze fell upon the portrait. "He would have ruined us both," he murmured. "All we built our name, our honor. I did not mean to kill him. I meant only to take the ledger." He resisted, fell, and I panicked. Holmes closed the ledger gently. "A truth delayed is not a truth denied," he said. "Lestrade will need your statement. It is best given freely." Sir Peregrine nodded once, slowly, like a man already walking toward his own judgment. Holmes watched him go in silence, then turned back to the portrait of the lady in blue. "There, Watson," he said at last, "is the true tragedy. A picture of grace watching over generations of deceit. The footsteps behind the painting were never of one man, they were of guilt itself, pacing through the years until the wall could bear its weight no longer." Sir Peregrine's confession hung in the air like the echo of a gunshot. The tolling of a far church bell drifted faintly through the fog-stained windows, solemn as a dirge. He stood by the hearth, his once proud frame bowed, his face carved with exhaustion and resignation. For a long moment no one spoke. Even Holmes seemed reluctant to break the gravity that had settled over the room. The great detective's expression, usually so detached in the face of guilt revealed, was touched now with a rare and weary sadness. "I do not ask for mercy," Sir Peregrine said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "Only understanding. My brother was a clever man, but a cruel one. He built his empire not upon charity, as the world believed, but upon the ruin of others. When I learned of the ledger, I begged him to destroy it to spare us all. He refused. He said it was his power, his protection, and that I would go down with him if I dared interfere." He looked toward the portrait that still leaned against the wall, the painted eyes of Lady Aurelia catching the firelight. "That night, I confronted him. He mocked me, laughed at my fear of scandal. I only meant to take the ledger, but he fought me. He stumbled as I pulled the painting aside to reach the recess, fell, struck his head, and it was done." Holmes's voice was very low. "You replaced the painting, locked the door, and left the scene to speak its own false tale." Sir Peregrine bowed his head. "I thought to save our name. I hid the ledger behind the wall and told the servants nothing. Caro came later. He had guessed some part of it. When he found the passage and the compartment, I realized what I had done. I had not silenced the truth. I had only delayed it." The fire crackled softly. Holmes stepped closer, the lamplight cutting sharp angles across his face. "The law will see the accident for what it was," he said at length. "But concealment, Sir Peregrine, breeds its own kind of guilt. You must tell Lestrade all. The shadow of this house will lift only when daylight is allowed to enter it." The older man nodded once, the stiffness of pride returning to his bearing. "You are right, Mr. Holmes. I have lived too long among locked doors." He turned toward the doorway, then paused and looked back at us both. "For what it is worth, I thank you. Better the truth exposed by another than carried like poison within." And with that, he was gone, his steps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Holmes remained still, gazing after him. "It is strange, Watson," he murmured, "how men build prisons not of iron, but of reputation. The Tollivers are undone. Yet, in truth, they were bound long before this night." I looked to the portrait once more. The serene features of Lady Aurelia seemed almost to pity us all. "You were right, Holmes," I said quietly. The footsteps behind the painting were guilt itself. He gave a faint, ironic smile. "You wax poetic, my dear fellow, but you are not wrong. Guilt has its own echo, and it is seldom silent." We gathered the ledger and the ring, sealing them in Lestrade's custody when he returned with his men at dawn. Holmes offered no flourish of triumph, no boast of deduction. He merely stood in the wan morning light, his expression unreadable. When the constables led Sir Peregrine away, calm, unresisting, a man already judged by conscience, Holmes turned to me and said, "You see, Watson, there are crimes that require no pursuit, only revelation. Once truth finds its voice, the criminal himself becomes its messenger." Outside, the fog began to lift at last, revealing the pale gold of a reluctant sunrise. Holmes looked toward it, his face softened by reflection. "Another page of human frailty closed," he said. "And yet, like all such tales, it will linger in the corners of my mind, the quiet sound of footsteps that began behind a painting and ended, as they must, in the open air." We rode back to Baker Street in a silence that even the clatter of the cab wheels could not dispel. The grey dawn had softened into a pale drizzle, and the lamps along Regent Street burned dully through the mist. Holmes sat with his arms folded, his chin upon his chest, his eyes fixed on some private horizon far beyond the window. I knew better than to intrude upon his thoughts when they took that inward turn, yet I could feel that his mind had not found peace. The case was concluded, the culprit confessed, and yet there lingered that restlessness that always came when the truth, though uncovered, left some corner in shadow. When at last we reached Baker Street, he threw off his coat, lit the fire, and took up his violin. For a quarter of an hour he played soft, wandering fragments of melody that rose and fell like sighs through the smoke. I watched him in silence until the music broke abruptly. He set the instrument aside and spoke in a tone curiously subdued. "There is an element of incompleteness, Watson. Sir Peregrine's confession satisfies the law, but not reason. A man who hides a crime of passion behaves with desperation, not method. Yet the details of that night, the locked door, the rearranged ladder, the extinguished lamp bear the stamp of deliberation. Do you not see? It was too orderly, too careful for accident." I frowned. "But the evidence, the bruise, the panic, the concealment, surely they all point to what we heard from his own lips." "Perhaps," Holmes said quietly, "and yet something whispers otherwise. Sir Peregrine is a man of control, a creature of habit and dignity. He would not have left the scene in disarray. Nor would he, with all his skill, have overlooked the plaster dust upon his brother's hand. It is not his nature to err so clumsily." He rose, suddenly, and paced before the hearth, his long fingers steepled. "No, Watson, I tell you, the tragedy of the Tollivers has yet one curtain left to fall." Before I could answer, a sharp rap came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression one of startled alarm. "A messenger, Mr. Holmes," she said, "from Scotland Yard." Holmes took the note, slit it open, and read aloud. "From Lestrade, Sir Peregrine Tolliver dead by his own hand an hour past, shot in his cell. No statement left." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Holmes stood motionless, the paper trembling faintly between his fingers. Then he said, almost to himself, "The final act, then. The Tolliver pride would rather meet death than the judgment of men." He threw the note upon the fire, where it curled and blackened to ash. "And so the truth dies with him, unless we can read the ashes left behind." The rest of that day Holmes worked with relentless energy, as though Sir Peregrine's death had rekindled his purpose. He sent for transcripts of Caro's testimony, for inventories of the Tolliver estate, for the architect's plans of the old mansion. By evening, he had spread them across the table in a chaotic order that only his own mind could decipher. At last, he looked up. "Watson, I must trouble you once more for a journey. There is a matter in Portland Place that cannot wait for the Yard's permission." When we arrived, dusk had gathered once again over the silent house. The servants had gone. The windows shuttered, and a constable stood sentinel by the gate. Holmes showed Lestrade's letter, and we were admitted without question. The gallery lay dim and cold, the portrait of Lady Aurelia restored to its place, her painted eyes calm as ever. Holmes approached the painting with a strange reverence. "She has presided over deceit long enough," he murmured. "But the walls still speak, Watson, if one knows how to listen." He knelt, examining the floor beneath, the recess. A few scattered flecks of wax caught the lamplight. He scraped one up with a blade and held it near his nose. "Sandalwood," he whispered, "the same scent that clung to Sir Benedict's gloves. Yet this wax is fresh, laid not a day before his death. Someone lit a candle here that night, someone other than the brothers Tolliver." He turned his gaze toward me, his expression grave but certain. "We are not done, Watson. There was a third presence in that room, and until we learn whose shadow stood behind the painting, the footsteps of this case will not cease to echo." Holmes's words struck me with that peculiar chill which accompanies the realization that what one had taken for an ending is but a deeper descent. The room seemed to hold its breath as his keen gaze traveled from the fleck of wax to the corners of the gallery, where shadow clung thickly even beneath the weak lamplight. "A third presence," I repeated under my breath. "But who? Surely not another member of the household. Lestrade's men accounted for all." He shook his head. "No servant, no guest. Someone who knew both the brothers and the passage behind this wall. See here, Watson. The candle was placed upon the edge of the recess, not within it. Whoever lit it did so to watch, not to search. A watcher stands apart from his subject, he observes. But for what purpose? That, said Holmes, is precisely what we must uncover. He moved to the narrow door that led into the hidden passage. It gaped faintly open, its hinges silent as he eased it wider. "The dust has been disturbed anew," he murmured. "The yard's constables have not been in here. Of that I am certain. Our visitor has returned since yesterday." A sudden draught passed through, stirring the hanging draperies. I caught, or thought I caught, the faintest rustle from within the darkness beyond. Holmes raised a hand for silence and withdrew a small lantern from his pocket. Its beam fell across the cramped corridor, revealing the iron rungs of a ladder leading down into the unseen depths below. He descended without hesitation, his movements soundless, and I followed, my heart thudding against the narrow stone walls. We found ourselves in a small chamber beneath the gallery, a forgotten relic of the older structure upon which the Tolliver mansion had been built. Dust lay thick upon the floor, yet fresh prints marred its surface. The outline of a boot, fine and narrow, a gentleman's make. Holmes crouched, examining the mark with meticulous care. A light step, but firm. Whoever came here was no servant. Note the spacing. Watson, he paused here, facing the wall. He rose and ran his fingers along the brick. "Hollow again," he murmured. "There is another recess." With a deft motion, he pressed at a certain stone. It gave way, revealing a small niche in which rested a single object, a silver snuff-box, tarnished but finely engraved. Holmes held it up to the lantern's glow. "The initials," he said softly, "are not BT, nor PT, but AV. "Then this cannot belong to either of the brothers," I exclaimed. "Precisely. And yet, Watson, there is a memory tickling the back of my mind." He opened the box. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, its edges yellowed. He spread it upon his palm. Written in a neat, feminine hand were the words, "When the light fails, the truth shall stand behind the painting." I stared at him in astonishment. A woman's hand. Could it have been? He met my eyes. Lady Aurelia Anselm, the woman in the portrait. "But she has been dead these 30 years. "Indeed," said Holmes quietly. "And yet her hand, or rather her secret, reaches through time. I recall the story now. Aurelia Anselm, Benedict Tolliver's benefactress in his youth, rumored to have been his mistress. She vanished from society, leaving her fortune to the Tollivers. Some whispered, foul play. But nothing was proved. This chamber, Watson, may be her monument and her revenge." He folded the note carefully and replaced it in his pocket. "The candle, the watching presence, these are no ghostly manifestations. Someone has discovered her secret and sought to claim what she left hidden, perhaps a descendant, perhaps one who knew of her connection to the Tollivers. Either way, this clue ties the past and present in one knot." As we ascended once more, the faint glimmer of dawn broke through the skylight above the gallery, casting long, spectral beams across the portrait's surface. Holmes stood before it, his features drawn yet alight with grim satisfaction. "It ends where it began," he murmured. "The lady behind the painting kept her final vigil, and through her, the house of Tolliver has confessed all its sins." I could find no words. The silence of the house seemed to settle upon us like dust from the ages. Then Holmes turned sharply toward the door, the briskness returning to his tone. "Come, Watson. Lestrade will wish to know that the Tolliver legacy is not merely a tale of greed and blood, but of love betrayed and secrets sealed in plaster. The footsteps have ceased at last, my dear fellow, but their echo will linger long in our memories." And as we stepped out into the waking streets of London, the mist curling away from the light of morning, I could not shake the vision of that painted face, the tranquil eyes of Lady Aurelia seeming almost to smile, as though at last she, too, had been avenged.